Is that
Mhm.
why the most, obviously the most financially successful example of African heroic fiction is Black Panther is so incredibly y- rooted in his community?
Yeah, like you can tell it's just totally different uh than all of the other Marvel films and just comics, because they had to root it in the African cultures, and there's no way that you can do that without that aspect. So you notice that he just wasn't a ruler of the Wakanda by himself. When he came and sat on the throne, what was around him? A council of elders, because that's how indigenous African cultures do it.
Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today we are with Asar Imhotep, who is a software developer, cultural theorist, and Africana researcher from Houston, Texas, whose research focus is the cultural, linguistic, and philosophical links between the ancient Egyptian civilizations and modern Bantu cultures of Central and South Africa. He is currently continuing his education in computer science with a concentration in artificial intelligence. That's an eclectic mix. LaMar, what are we doing today?
Well, another thing I want to add to the bio, Asar is also my brother as a scribe. We both come out of the same scribal tradition. Mukreketi Amen is both of our instructors. But what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the African origins of the concept of the hero in literature. It's a topic that we don't really hear too much about for a lot of different reasons, which we're about to kind of get into. Asar, could you give us some insights on the academic hurdles in regard to having the African story told, especially in regards to like our literature?
Alrighty. Well, first and foremost, I just want to thank you both for having me on your program and to discuss this very important topic in the context of the themes of your show. And I find it refreshing and exciting, and I look forward to the conversation that we're about to have. With that said, to your question, I would argue that it is primarily the result of just good old fashioned colonialism. And any kind of colonial body that takes over a people has to project themselves as the dominant, and they do this in many different ways. Of course, usually if they had to take over an area, it was because of either some kind of swindling or cunning on one part, let's say in a economic hitman type situation, or an actual physical dominance as a result of more advanced weaponry or something to this nature. And then, of course, once you have colonized a group, then of course, you have to justify your colonization because you are more intelligent or you have a better relationship with the gods. And because of these particular factors, um, you know, all things and all life starts with the colonizing entity. And with Europe colonizing areas of the world, um, because they were collectively able to dominate by way of violence in the Americas, in Africa, in Europe, and of course in Asia in certain parts, uh, they had to project themselves in a particular type of light, because they had to justify why they had colonized these groups of people in the first place. So, for example, like when you read Christopher Columbus's journals and things, to take back to Spain, you know, he talks about how the Native Americans that he met in the Caribbean had no weapons and had no idea of metal and its usage. And the first thing that comes to his mind is that these people will be easy to conquer. You know, instead of viewing them and it would calling them savages, primitive, and things of that nature. So, instead of thinking about how highly advanced they are, because they've developed a society where they don't have weapons to kill other human beings, that they have kind of a social structure in which they can non-violently resolve conflict. They saw them, Columbus and his ilk saw them as savages. And so, you know, because of their savagery, because they don't know what we know, then that justifies us, you know, to colonize them. And as a result of this worldwide colonial project, of course, they had to start learning about the people. You have to, you know, any army has to do reconnaissance, and they have to get a sense of who their enemy is. And as a result of going around the world and documenting, you know, who these people are, they started to, of course, have these preconceived notions about who they are, and as a result of their own kind of Eurocentric thinking. And again, this idea that these people are primitive because they don't do what we do and they don't have what we have, develop a certain particular mindset that these people around the world didn't have what we had. Not understanding the historical relationship between places like Asia and Africa, which is kind of the central argument, for example, of Martin Bernal's Black Athena that was published, I think, in '89.
Yeah, excellent book.
You know, and so that, you know, because in academia they were saying that, you know, the Greeks, they call it the Greek miracle, that, you know, based on their own genius, that they just emerged out of the soil, and all of these great philosophies and technologies for the time and stuff emerged. This great art and architecture just came out of nowhere, and this is the basis of quote unquote Western civilization. And then here comes, you know, people like Dr. George G.M. James and Shekansi Diop and Dr. Teofilo Benga, and then of course Martin Bernal is saying, no, when we actually read the records of the Greeks, they're saying that we got this stuff from these Africans over here, and these Africans over here in what we now call Egypt are Black. And, you know, Martin Bernal adds a different component, and he adds the Phoenicians and, you know, the Jewish elements and influences also in Greek culture. And so, of course, this caused a big stir in the 90s in academia. And so he got a whole bunch of backlash for pointing out the racism in academia, more specifically in the classic studies. And so, you know, it saying all that to say that it's a long history of this type of thinking and it doesn't start in academia. It starts with the colonial project itself. And then what you see in academia doesn't, excuse me, is just simply a symptom of this deeper cultural idea, that they have to maintain in order to bring themselves in a particular type of light. And so with that being said, and especially with the influence of the Africans on the Greeks, even when you look up the word hero itself, the online etymological dictionary traces it all the way through French and of course Latin, and then Latin borrowing it from the Greeks, and essentially meaning a demigod, a warrior hero. But it also says in the text that it is of unknown origin, meaning, and so they hypothesize some Proto-Indo-European words, but there's no clear indication that it is even an Indo-European word. And so this, of course, is a big indicator that either the Greeks invented the word or they borrowed it from someone. And it is my contention that, like many words in the Greek language that have no Indo-European roots, was borrowed from the ancient Egyptians and is in reference to a word cognate with Heru, who is a deity, son of Osiris, or Asar, or Wasir, and Aset, Isis to the Greeks, who had to go through his own warrior journey against his uncle, Set, who they were contending for the throne in various different stories. But the conflict usually has to deal with Heru being too young to rule, and then Set trying to usurp the throne from the rightful heir, because Osiris had died and been cut up into 20 pieces, 20 or 22 pieces by Set, and so now Osiris is living and ruling in the what they call the Duat, which is the underworld. And as a result of him ruling down there, someone has to rule up here on the earthen plane, and that's in by custom, it is the firstborn son, and that of course would be Heru. And we got to keep it in, and we also got to add this component, and that is the kings of Kemet were Heru kings. Like, they even have a Heru name. One of the 5 names that the kings are normally, they call it the Golden Horus name. And so they identify, the kings are identified as Horus. And so, what a demigod is someone who is half divine, half human, and that's how, like, a king is considered, in many parts of Africa, when you have this concept of divine kinship. And so so the denial or of the origins of the hero concept is also based in this denial of the African influence on Greek culture, and ideas and things of that nature. So, but I also want to just interject the idea that these hero concepts, we can argue is African, but in a way that is because all human beings come from Africa. And that these kinds of themes and ideas and challenges which influence certain myths, certain mythos, was more than likely already embedded in the Homo sapiens sapien,
right,
prior to them migrating into Asia and populating the rest of the world. So I don't want to make it seem as if like nobody else had a hero concept. And then, you know, after the migrations, and then here comes the Africans with this new concept, and then it spread around the world. Not saying that at all.
Yeah.
It's more than likely that just as, you know, human beings having now analytical and creative thought in speech, and our form of communication being primarily stories and mythos, that these are deeply embedded in just early Homo sapiens sapiens development in culture, and that these ideas spread out with man as they developed and settled in other areas of the world. I know that was a real long answer. But,
now, that's
oops,
we,
I've
you know, and geeks over here, we love the long answers.
I've got a couple of things I want to clarify before LaMar
right.
moves on to his next question. So when you said hero most likely comes from Heru, my brain went, oh well, duh. It sounds really obvious. Have you received like backlash for that kind of contention?
No, and you know, doing linguistics, we have to be careful about what we call chance lookalikes.
Okay.
And so, you know, something may sound plausible and just, you know, obvious, but in reality, it may not be the case. It just could be coincidence. And so when I make an argument, I try not to do like there's more that has to go into it. And so I haven't made a formal argument on that, but I know others have. And that's something that I'm working on just as a larger project, finding all of the Egyptian words that were borrowed into the Greek language. And this was a project that started with Sheikh Anta in Civilizational Barbarism, and even continued by Martin Banal in his 4-book series of Black Athena, and the last one being volume 3. Even though there's 4 volumes, one is a response text. So there's like volume 1, volume 2, then Black Athena responds, and then it's volume 3. So volume 3, even though all 3 books have linguistic arguments, volume 3 is the strict linguistic arguments of all of the borrowings from Egypt into Greek, as well as, and I think Martin Banal makes the same type of argument. Okay. But you know, I also want to keep it in the context of the larger context of what the borrowing is and what the concept is, and to show that it is real significant for Greek culture. And so from the Greeks, again, it goes into Italy amongst the Latin speakers, and then into France amongst the French. And then when the French took over the British Isles, we borrowed and inherited a lot of words from them in English, and that's how it comes into the English lexicon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and before we go to the next thing, one thing I wanted to say, there's a book called The Greek Achievement.
Okay.
In that book, the author, his name is escaping me. I think it's over at my office, or else I pull it out. But he basically says that we have primaries from the Greeks, where they basically say that whenever they came into Kemet and they saw like the temples and stuff with all the Medu Neter on the outside and stuff, he basically says that the Greeks didn't know that you could build stone structures that tall, because a lot of these structures, like these temples and stuff, a lot of them are like 70, 80 feet tall. So they didn't know that it was possible to do that. and they literally thought it was magic, right? Because they
Mhm.
didn't know anything about the science and stuff. And a lot of when these people try to say that like Medu Neter is like this mysterious magical thing and you can tap into this and go floating off into space, right?
Mhm.
Comes from that Greco-Roman thing, because they would see the writings on the wall, and in a lot of cases they thought that the writing was holding the temples up, you know.
Yeah.
um we would, you know, the Africans wouldn't let them get anywhere close to the actual construction sites, but they would just kind of be like, yeah, man, don't come over here and bother us while we work, and go over there and sit down. You can watch.
Mhm.
So, and
Yeah.
and also to speak to what you were saying about, you know, about the unknown origin in a lot of these
Mhm.
etymologies and stuff. You know, a lot of the times when you see that, the word traces back to an African word most of the time. And so there's another word that I allege does the same thing. They try to say that the word, like the root of the word of like words like patron and patriarchy and stuff like that, um, they say that
Okay.
that word comes from the noises that children make when they're calling for their father. Like that's where they say the origin of that comes from, right? And
Mhm.
with that, number one, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And number two, um, there was a guy that actually did a study on like African languages they compared to like these Proto-Indo-European languages and stuff. And
Mhm.
you know, it's a really interesting study. His name's Stephen Crowley. He has some really interesting work. But I allege that that word actually comes from like the word that's a part of the phrase iripot or iripert in
Mhm.
Medu, that, you know, signifies like the, almost like how we say the head man of the house or whatever like that.
Yes.
They would call it like the patricians is another word that they would use, you know, like today or whatever. But
Uh-huh.
um, also to get into what you were talking about how the colonization process is a, you know, this is like a symptom of the colonization process. There's a book, I know you're familiar with this book called Pygmy Kitabu, right?
Yeah.
Now, I want y'all to listen to the insanity in this book, right? But before I do that, let me do this. I'm gonna go into let's see, I have it pulled up here. E.A. Wallace Budge, a guy that a lot of people that like to say a lot of bad stuff about Kemet, they love this guy. But he wrote a travel guide for Kemet back in 1890. I used to have the first edition of it. I gave it to Moot Ricchetti as a gift, but I have it here in PDF. But he says in a part of his book called, it's called The Ancient Egyptians. He says the Egyptians, whom the sculptures and monuments make known to us being among the most ancient inhabitants of the country, belong beyond all doubt to the Caucasian race, and they seem to have migrated from the east. The original home of the invaders was apparently Asia, and they made their way across Mesopotamia and Arabia, across the Isthmus of Suez into Egypt, right? And
What
in the,
kind of insanity?
but check this out though. It's just getting started. In the 1910 version of that book, he says the same thing, but he changes it from the Caucasian race. He changes it to they appear to have been the descendants of an invading race who entered Egypt in the pre-dynastic period and conquered the country, and then intermarried with the indigenous people whom they found in possession of the Nile Valley. Now,
Mhm.
the interesting thing about that is that he writes this book in 1911 called Osiris and the Egyptian Resurrection, right?
Mhm.
So in this book, he basically makes the argument that the people in Kemet were black, and that, you know, and that, but that they were cannibals and all this other kind of nasty stuff, right? So
Mhm.
and then he ends up letting it slip, and he says that the concept of Usir actually comes out of Sudan. It's not indigenous to Kemet, but you know, we know now it comes from a lot further south than that, right? But at the same time, they pretty much basically they was like, hey man, listen, don't say anything like that again. You say something like that again, and you know what's gonna happen, right? So he basically got a scolding for saying that, even though he was trying to, you know, make us be filthy and stuff, he got a come to Jesus moment for even saying something like that. But
Yeah,
then,
'cause you got to please the sponsors.
yeah, you know, you get into this book, Pygmy Kitabu,
Mm-hmm.
The guy that writes this book, he makes this argument that, and we know for those of you who have never heard of any of this stuff, the term pygmy is a derogatory term. It's like referring to an Inuit person as an Eskimo, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the proper name for the people, you can just say the Twa. But he says that he's basically making a differentiation using somebody else's work to say that the Twa people weren't us, they weren't Africans. And
Yeah.
basically, he says that like the pygmies, Caucasians or whites are very ancient residents of the so-called dark continent. Negroes, and then it goes into this whole thing where they basically try to like tie it into the Bible. They basically say that in the Sonia Cole discussed this topic in the prehistory of East Africa, which is a filthy book if I've ever read one. And she says there were apparently three basic stocks in Africa before the appearance of the Negro: the Proto-Australoids with heavy brow ridges, the Proto-Bushmanoids, and the Proto-Caucasoids, or to give them a more, less accurate name, the Proto-Hamites. All of the upper Paleolithic types peoples of Kenya were of Caucasoid or Proto-Hamitic stock. They are
Mm-hmm.
by the Gambel's Cave and Naivashka skeletons, as well as the skeleton from Olduvai in northern Tanganyika. Now, the interesting thing about all of that foolishness that I just read is that these people that live in what they call the Arab Republic of Egypt, they basically are still making that argument. The reason why I read all of that is because that book came out in 1973. So this stuff is still prevalent. Like, these people are not playing games. I just wanted to point that out because, we talk about like old stuff, but at the same time, this stuff is still affecting the scholarship that we have today. So it hasn't gone anywhere. So it's important that we develop the wherewithal to deal with this stuff.
Mm.
But
Yeah, that book is problematic. It's problematic, but for a skilled scholar, it also has some jewels.
yes, it does.
And because we got to remember that the author is someone who actually lived with
Mm-hmm.
the Vatwa people in the Ituri forest for decades.
Yeah.
And so he understands the language. He's accurately describing their stories and their mythos, their customs. But then, of course, he's doing some meta analysis and bringing in of course, well, since they're, obviously human beings and geniuses, the only way that this could possibly happen is if these Caucasians came into Central Africa, these dark whites.
Right.
Caucasians, came and migrated, from Europe into Africa and became the quote unquote Batwa.
Yeah.
And so, it's very problematic, but he does have some, and I cite his texts, in certain capacities for certain arguments.
Mm-hmm.
I have that text at well, right now it's in my storage in Philly.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, because matter of fact, it is almost a source for that famous quote from Dr. Ben that we came from the mountains.
Yeah.
We came from the foothills of the mountains of the moon where the god Hapi dwells. Like,
right.
He says something similar in that text.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, like, for anybody that doesn't know what I'm talking about, it's Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen, a famous elder, now deceased scholar, who introduced a lot of people in the African American community to Nile Valley studies.
Mm-hmm.
And, he made this argument that the Egyptians themselves made in the Papyrus Hunefer, that we came from the foothills, the phrasing attributing to the ancient Egyptians themselves, saying that we came from the foothills of the mountains of the moon where the god Hapi dwells. But looking at the primary text of Hunefer, you can't find it. And so it's interesting that I've read somewhere else something similar, And so what I'm thinking is that there was, at around this time, there was a text circulating that made this argument that he originally got it from. And so like Pygmy Katabo, reinforces my hypothesis that that was the case, because he says something similar there.
Yeah.
And but of course he doesn't cite. That's what upset me. He doesn't cite. He just, in other words, he's citing it like everybody should know. It's like when you say Einstein in a text, like you just, we don't say, we don't have to say Albert Einstein from 1908 or 14 or whatever in his theory that you just is supposed to be just so known that, when I say Einstein, that this is who I'm talking about. And so we don't cite necessarily certain things when we mention Einstein's name. And he's saying it as if there's like, this is known, like there's this document circulating, amongst academics. And so I'm still on the hunt for that original text. But I'm sorry, continue.
No, you're good. I'm glad that you did that, because what the point that you made about that particular book, the Pygmy Katabu book, there's a lot of good information in it, but if you know what you're looking at, the bogus stuff kind of jumps out at you. It's like corner at you. You know what I mean? So to kind of dismiss that, because it really doesn't have anything to do with anything else in the book except for him trying to do what it is he's trying to do. But he actually, and he wrote a series of those books. One about the Congo, this one wrote one about the animals, and he won the
Animal Kitabu.
Yeah, that's a good book too. He won the Nobel Prize, I think, for the Pygmy Kitabu book. But I guess we'll move on to the next section, where we talk about I want to talk about like this thing about like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and how generally people say that this is where the stories about heroes and things like start, because that's like a big thing. But by the time that you get the Epic of Gilgamesh as like one book, because we know it comes from like smaller texts, and they kind of combine it and make it into like this one story. But we already have these narratives in Kemet that like predate it, and stuff. So we're already doing this kind of stuff. Like when you get into like especially like in the Middle Kingdom, where the language just kind of like blossoms, and there's all technical advances with the language. Like you see determinatives are like being like more grounded as like standard procedure in the script and things like that. I wanted to talk about that a little bit, because that actually like goes back to what you were saying about like the stuff in academia being a tool of colonization.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring Sumeria up. Later on today, and I know by the time this comes out to your public, it would, it would have already passed for them. But I'm doing a brief lesson on I should say, there's an individual who did a program making an argument for or against the notion that the Sumerians were Black.
Okay.
I'm not trying to make that argument. What I'm making, the argument I'm making is that the history is a bit more complex and nuanced than simply the Sumerians were Black. And the reason why I say this is because the language betrays any notion that a Black African people were not present there. And so the argument that I make, and so there's a book that I published in around this time in January of 2020 called Aluja Volume 2, Shiana into Religion and Philosophy. And in that text, I make my argument that there was a group of Africans who in ancient times traveled through the Nile Valley and ended up in various different parts of what we call the Levant, Arabia, and even further north in the Black Sea or whatnot. And these migrations and interactions over a long period of time is what facilitated the development of Proto-Semitic, Proto-Indo-European, and Sumerian being the last vestige of that group or those groups of Africans who settled into these areas. And so there's ideas and concepts that emerged in the Sumerian. And so what I'm saying here is that with the Sumerians, it's an issue of a smaller group of Africans, but an influential group of Africans settling in a particular community, but over time ultimately being absorbed by natives, saying around that came and settled. Mm-hmm. And so, over time, the makeup of those individuals change. And so, it's just like how you see African Americans, our skin becomes a little lighter amongst of our populations to the point where some can even pass. We even had that term back in the day that some could even pass for white. Now, what kept us in the United States from, totally being absorbed by the population is because we segregation laws, where they tried, and the ghettoization of the community, where it forced us to be amongst each other. But if you are in like certain areas, like in South America, where where they were, in such small numbers that they just emerged into society, even like in places like Mexico, in certain areas, the skin color and everything changes. And so this is what I'm arguing essentially with Sumerian language and culture, that there is an indigenous population there. It's the same thing with the Semites. With Semitic, it's a group of Africans who come and live amongst in the Levant, and over time, their interactions develop what we call Proto-Semitic, and then the Semitic languages. And when, of course, later on, the Semites come and take over Sumeria, the Akkadians. Mm-hmm. And that further changes the dynamic of what you see in Sumeria. So with that said, both Sumeria and Egypt, going back to the part of your question dealing with the determinatives, mm-hmm. the determinatives are essential for understanding the nature of the script, because it doesn't have the vowels.
Right.
But what I argue is that the determinatives are more critical and essential to the understanding of the language itself, because the language is a class language. So I know in most books dealing with ancient Egypt and learning the script, you're going to come across the term determinative. And so to explain, for those who don't understand what I'm talking about, in the ancient Egyptian script, you have a set of hieroglyphs that have phonetic values, consonant values, or semi-vowel values. And then you have another set of hieroglyphs that have no phonetic value, but that are at the end of the hieroglyphic word to bring clarity and context to the word, that the part of the word that has the phonetic values. And so the term that is being used now more often is classifier, because it is a class language. So the what we're calling the determinatives are actually class. It tells you what class that the original word belongs in. And so you have what is called class languages. For example, the Bantu languages. And for example, you have a root into, right, which means thing, existing thing, an object. But in the Bantu languages, nouns belong to a certain type of class, and their determinatives are prefixed, or their classifiers are prefixed. So the prefix will tell you, well, what kind of thing, what class does this thing belong to that we're ultimately talking about here. So you can have a muntu with a classifier or a prefix mu, and that is a human being. So remember, into is a thing, a being, to exist or whatnot. So the mu is a class dealing with the singular human class. But if we want to talk about the plural, we would say ba into, human beings, the plural human being class. But what if it is a non-existent, a non-intelligent thing? So for example, this mouse, right? It would be a kintu, because this is still an existing thing, but this belongs to the class of non-animate, non-intelligent things. So it's a kintu. And so, this is why I believe, and based on some other comparative narratives, some comparative examples, that the classifiers emerge out of the language and the thought processes of the people, and not simply because of the script. Because there's other evidence that even when you're looking at the words themselves, they still have the classifier grammar and morphology in it. Mm-hmm. And so it proves that it is a class language. And so I wish I was on my laptop or something, I could show you, by sharing the screen. But the Sumerian script also has classifiers, and it operates in the same way that the Egyptian hieroglyphs. But again, my argument is that it's not an issue of any one of them influencing one another. It is because they are the same people, and because they had the same proto language that ultimately separated into these different spots. So the Egyptians are a group of people who remained in the Nile River Valley, and then developed the script indigenously there. And then, of course, again, my argument that one of the other main groups, settled in southern Iraq. It became, the Sumerians and things there. And this is in the relationship between the Sumerians language and African languages. There has been scholarship going back to the early 1900s making these arguments. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm the latest in a series of scholars who are making that argument based on the historical comparative method, which is the scientific method for historical comparative linguists. And so, you know, the African character of these things are visible in the text and also visible in the scripts and the way that the scripts are even written. And even in the Alluja Volume 2 book that I mentioned, I do a side-by-side comparison of even many of the Sumerian classifiers with the Egyptian classifiers. And you'll see that they're using the exact same words, you know, for these classifiers. And so, you know, we're building on some scholarship to show that there's even a relationship between Sumerian, ancient Egyptian, of course, and Bantu, as well as in another book that I published that year, a few months later, towards a comparative dictionary of Chicam, is my word for Kemet, Chicam in modern African languages. I do a comparison of Sumerian and the Meroitic script. Well, not the script itself, but the words that we have that have been deciphered. And so the Meroitic language has not been fully deciphered. We know what the phonetic values are of the signs, but we haven't pinned the language to where, you know, you can fully decipher, you know, some of the words itself. But yeah, there's a relationship there, and that has to be, you know, put into context between the two groups. But before we move on, I wanted to say that in 2016, I wrote a text, Nesu Biti, King in Ancient Egyptian. And in that text, yes, there's a chapter on Osiris, and I examine the Luo connection to that word. And so with all the stuff that you're saying, I say in that text, and I got a clue from I don't know if you're familiar with the scholar Dr. Kipkoech Sambu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Dr. Kipkoech Sambu is of the Collagen people, mm-hmm. who primarily live now in Kenya, but they originate in the Sudan and Egypt, mm-hmm. of old, and migrated south during the Greek invasion time. And so when, you know, he's produced 2 books making the argument that the proto-Collagen were in ancient Egypt as part of the warrior class, mm-hmm. Of the ancient Egyptians, and he provides a compelling, you know, argument for that. Matter of fact, his PhD dissertation was on it, mm-hmm. And so I was asking him about the name Wasir, and he was like, well, there's no formal God in our culture and language by that term. And so, you know, there's no context, but you might want to look in amongst the Luo people, because mm-hmm. there's people there named Osir. Mm-hmm. That's a common name amongst them. And so when I did, I interviewed a number of people and elders amongst the Luo, and so they gave me the breakdown of what the name meant. And then, of course, I went and picked up a Luo dictionary and Luo grammar book to get a fuller understanding of it. And so, and then compared it with some things that you see in amongst ancient Egypt. And I'm like, this is definitely a Nilotic word. And the concept of, and it makes sense because, you know, even I don't remember if it was Diodorus or if it was Herodotus. It was one of them who mentioned that Osiris was an Ethiopian, and he made a colony in Egypt, and Egypt developed. So that like they're attributing Osiris coming from further south amongst the Ethiopians, and so that was just their term for all the people down south. So these of course are where your Nilotic speaking groups, emerge. And so so yeah, you're on point with that, in terms of being a stand up, and then of course being the pillar. And matter of fact, when you go to in the Nigeria, they have a deity Won that is that is the king and ruler of the underworld and judge amongst them. And so you know that Iwin is an epithet of Osiris.
Yeah.
In the Nile Valley, and I show this. Matter of fact, in Yoruba language, the word "won" means pillar, and they also have another word "iwon" or "iwen" dealing with spirit, and stuff. So I deal with that in the Lucha Bargain too, as well.
Okay,
but
I haven't made it all the way through the Nesubidi. I just started it the other day because I bought it like maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I wanted to show you this. We know that like the Jed pillar and stuff, there's a relationship between agriculture and the tree, right? Ever seen like, can y'all see that? I'm gonna see if you can see it.
You're gonna have to send me this image so I can. Yeah.
But basically, it's Usia's name, and then there's a tree popping out of the top of it. Like, I didn't know, because this came from the Ptolemaic period. We had an exhibit, Ancient Egypt Sunken Cities, that just left. Took this picture because I was talking to somebody about how Usia is associated with the tree and the jet column and all of that is like a tree trunk. And so I showed that image. I didn't know if you had ever seen one of those stones before. That was the first time I'd ever seen one.
Not that one in particular, no. But it's not surprising because, again, that word seer, has to deal with erection and in being a stand-up, just like you said, like, a seer is like one who's a stand-up person, one who's solid. But as you get the further nuances, is of course is somebody who is reliable, somebody who you can count on, and also a defender. But you see these various different types of manifestations of Wasir in the Egyptian literature. Like you see one with him sitting on a hill with an erect phallus, and then of course others with vegetation coming out of them, like wheat, and stuff when he's buried. And so of course with the tree, it's just the same because he is a personification and representation of vegetation, in many respects. And so, as a matter of fact, this shows the influence even on the biblical tradition, because Osiris and Set represent two different modes of production, and so and lifestyle and living, because Set represents the nomadic pastoral life, and Osiris, of course, is the settled agricultural life. Right. And what people don't realize is that there has been an ongoing conflict, especially in Africa, that's still going on now between the Oko Ogun, for example, in Nigeria, and the Fulani, and that is the farmers and the nomadic pastoralists. And ultimately, what we're getting here is when we're talking about the story of Osiris and Set and the battle, and then of course, which leads to the Heru epic, and the challenges that he has to face in becoming king, is the fundamental issue of who has the rights and access to land.
Yeah.
And so the the agriculturalists are saying, they now have demarcated land and they have planted crops and stuff to this nature because, of course, our ancestors, we were all nomadic in the times past, but with the development of agriculture, we've been able to settle in a place and grow our food instead of having, to hunt and gather like in previous times. And so it becomes an issue of national security when you have a group of nomadic herders coming by and their cattle is eating the crops.
Yeah.
And so there's this conflict. And so when you see in this battle amongst Set and Osiris, it is a metaphor for the conflict between nomadic pastoralists and agriculturalists and the access to land. And so in the Bible, it is reversed. And so, the Egyptians, of course, side with the agriculturalists, Osiris, and Set becomes the evil person. And they're both brothers, keep in mind. But when it comes to Cain and Abel, it's the reverse. Matter of fact, the word Habel is matter of fact, it comes from the same root that ultimately gives us the word Hebrew. And it has to deal with passing over. It's a description of like how like cattle just, roams and don't settle anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so when you're talking about a Hebrew or its syllabic inverse, when you say Arab, you're talking about a group of people who don't settle, and live with their cattle and, fight and live and defend that cattle. The Calajan were those type of people in times past. And so, and Cain is Chayin or Chayin in Hebrew. And it is cognate with the word Ogun. And, you'll see in the text that, Chayin and Tubal Cain is the one who built the first city, and we know it's a metaphor because one man can't build the city. Mm-hmm. But it's
unless you're Superman,
basically, and who can reverse the earth in time. But the conflict in the biblical tradition, of course, now it's the agriculturalist and the metallurgist who kills the pastoralist, because the Hebrews were nomadic pastoralists. They were sheep herders, and cattle herders. And so what you're getting is these deeper conflicts, these articulations of deeper conflicts on access to land, and they're putting it in creative ways so the people know who their enemies are and why. And I think that is important to note, even when we're talking about some of these particular stories or whatnot that may be not necessarily grounded in history in the way that we think of history, right, with a specific date and a particular person or whatnot, but just, a series of events and conflicts that, have emerged over time, and they're trying to keep these story alive or these memories alive for the people. And so they put it into these type of these epic stories, which initiates, the deeper understanding of where they are now and how they got there.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to the next part, which you went into it a little there, about what it means to be a hero from an African sense. And I'm gonna recall a conversation I had with Baba Bonacci. Shout out to him, my first MetaNet instruction. I'll probably send him a tape, send him the link to this too, so he can watch it. But we were talking about how, the symbol for netter, right? A lot of these early Egyptologists they thought that it was an axe, right?
Mhm.
So, but when you look at like the earliest forms of the symbol, like it's clear that it's not an axe, right? It's,
Mhm.
so because we see like basically the pole and it's wrapped up, and which is also that word netter or netcher is also a word for like the wrappings. But
Mhm.
and so I was basically talking to him and saying, well, it seems to me that they would think that it was an axe before anything else, because if you go look at these people's cultures, like when you go into like even like the Sparta and like even like the Minoan civilization and stuff like that, all the way
Mhm.
in Rome and all the way over, there's a deification of violence, right? And
Mhm.
see it, that going back to what you were saying about like these pastoral traditions, and it actually carries over into like into the United States. Like when we had done a show about the KKK, right? And I
Yeah.
talked about the pastoral tradition that like the Scots Irish brought over here to America, and
And a culture of honor.
yeah, their honor culture, yeah. And
Mhm.
so he had asked me, he was like, well, what's wrong with that? And I was like, well, in a particular sense, there's nothing wrong with it, because your immune system is violent, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
I hope my immune system stays violent, but
Mhm.
that's violence for a purpose, right? And it's a tool that you use when you need to use it. So in that regard,
Mhm.
I have no problem with it. I mean, look at the Norma palette, right? No
Yeah.
problem. But um, but you see this motif of like the hero in Western culture of being this person who has like these big muscles and they're constantly knocking things over and cutting people's heads off and doing all of these things like this. And you see that in Africa too. And like I said, I'm not knocking that, you got to do what you got to do, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But
Mhm.
you also see this tradition in Africa of these heroes who apply their minds to solving problems, because there's a very direct correlation with who cultures hold up as heroes to the way that they view solving their problems, because that's ultimately what culture
Yeah.
is about. It's about how you solve your problems. So um so I go like to the story like the Golden Lotus, for example,
Mhm.
which is my scribal named Jetamach, is a play on the guy in that story who parts the water, right?
Mhm.
He's a guy who solved the problem using his mind, you know, as opposed to, in that particular story. And you see these stories over and over and over and over and over again, even when you look at like the teaching literature of Kemet, for example. And you have these maxims, and it's basically teaching you how to solve your problems throughout your life. If you want to have a good life, you encounter problems. If you do this, you won't have to worry about it. And even into
Mhm.
traditions like in Western Africa and Southern Africa, where you have these trickster deities that you have to outsmart them in the story,
Mhm.
right? So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, if you could.
Mhm. Yeah. It's interesting that you state that. I have an ongoing research project uh, for a book that I'm writing titled Religious Proselytization as a Form of Violence,
Mhm.
subtitled The Infringement of the African Principle of Simultaneous Validity. I
Mhm.
know it's a long uh, title, and I'm trying to figure out a way to reduce it. But, in there, I talk about the cultures of honor
Mhm.
and how no matter where you are in the world, that these nomadic pastoralist groups have a common characteristic,
Mhm.
and it is this notion of uh, this warrior hero, right? Like the hero for them is the warrior, because you got to think about what it takes in terms of a personality to be a pastoralist. And because you are protecting cows, sheep, donkeys, whatever. These are animals that have no natural defenses against predators that have evolved for millions and millions of years, whether they be tigers, lions, alligators, cheetahs, the hyenas, wolves, mountain lions. I guess I said lions already. Whatever these types of predators are, even eagles, and flying birds, depending on the size of the cattle. So, these top predators are 24/7 trying to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just walking by with a buffet of food, they're going to attack. So you have to build up a certain type of character to be able to fight off and fend. You have to develop a certain type of fearlessness to defend against those type of predators. But not only that, you have to defend against other pastoralists,
right?
Because in their culture, cattle is king. Cattle rules everything. So whether you're talking about the Dinka, whether you're talking about the Nuer, whether you're talking about the College, whether you're talking about the Fulani, these groups, whether you're talking about the Proto-Indo-Europeans on the steppes, whether you're talking about the Mongolians, and other groups, and even when there was a study showing that certain Native American groups that who were essentially agriculturalists or just regular hunter gatherers,
Mm-hmm.
as soon as the European came and introduced them to the pastoralist lifestyle and introduced the horse, they picked up the characteristics of other nomadic pastoralist groups in terms of violence and invading people, because what they'll do is invade other groups and take their cattle.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish I had I wonder, is it in Nesubiti? Did I cite? It's somewhere in there. I can't remember. But I cite a text in one of them, in one of these books, and they're talking about it's a African group in East Africa, in the Sudan, who talks about the nature of violence that emerges because of the pastoral tradition, and so all of this comes into play when you're thinking about just how different the hero is amongst them, because the person has to be young, physically fit, and able to defend the people. They have to be a warrior. But in other places, the hero, they may still be young, because you have to have an element of coming to know yourself, and coming to know yourself and your abilities through challenge. But it's not necessarily, you don't get these stories necessarily where they're having to fight off and kill off, a group of people, or, something to this nature. But, it may be disguised itself as a dragon, in other stories, or something to that nature, some large, animal or whatnot. And so, but in the African context, and I don't want to say, I'll say an African context, versus because there are some African groups that are nomadic pastoralists where their heroes mirror what you see amongst the Indo-Europeans, but that's because of the similar, mode of production for them.
Right.
And so, but there's another aspect of this where the wisdom comes in. And so if you ever get a chance to get a hold of Dr. Kaikosa Kajangu's PhD dissertation titled Beyond the Colonial Gaze, in it, he cites an author by the name of Mabika. And Mabika introduces us to this concept of the open and closed senses. So the open senses are the senses just like your everyday senses, touch, smell, being able to see, feel, or whatnot. Those are your open senses. These senses are what is awakened when you are born, just as a matter of existence. Then you have what are called the closed senses. And this takes a deeper set of wisdom and spirituality and connection with spirits and ancestors and certain rites and things of that nature. And these closed senses are usually awakened as a result of initiation. So initiation helps you to open. And so the closed senses are usually referred to as, how should I say? You're born with two eyes, open in this world. And then when you die, these other two eyes awaken, in that world. But you can open those other two eyes while you're living, and, of course, through initiation, because they help you to see, the deeper aspects of reality that, without that particular type of training that you would take for granted, just moving about in your everyday normal experience. And so, with that comes the way of the warrior and the way of the chief. Now, I should back up some more, because now we start getting into this concept called the lesser and greater hungers. And so the lesser hunger is a type of appetite that can be satiated by the accumulation of material things on earth. But then there are some who have a greater hunger that is looking for the deeper aspects of life, for which only wisdom and knowledge can satiate that hunger. Now, there's a demon that we call the syndrome of foolishness that hinders or that likes to exacerbate the lesser hunger. And these individuals are people who cannot move beyond, like they want access of things material. And so they become slaves to the lesser hunger. This is one of the books that I was talking about that I wrote in 2020. So this is more so linguistics, some comparative linguistic work towards a comparative dictionary of Chicano and modern African languages. But this text here is Aluja Volume 2. And so it's a pretty thick book. And so I have a chapter in here called Ptah and the, did I call it the lesser hunger? What did I call it? Yeah, Ptah and the dual hunger. So we're talking about the two hungers, the dual hunger. And so in, I talk about the state of perfection, what that means, you know, the way of the warrior and the way of the chief, which I'll get into in a little bit. Understanding your powers of beings, the open and closed senses, et cetera, et cetera. Just to get to the part where we talk about Ptahhotep. And so I cite Ptahhotep in this way. And so the Prissy Papyrus. And so I have the transliteration and then the translation of, I don't even know if you can really see it, you know, on here, you know, of this particular citation. So Ptahhotep says, if thou be among people, make for thyself love, the beginning and the end of the heart. One that knoweth not his course shall say in himself, seeing thee, he that ordereth himself duly becometh the owner of wealth. I shall copy his conduct. Thy name shall be good, though thou speak not. Thy body shall be fed, thy face shall be seen among the neighbors. Thou shalt be provided with what thou lackest. As to the man who obeyeth his belly, he causeth disgust in the place of love. His heart is wretched, his body gross. He is insolent towards those endowed of the God. He that obeyeth his belly hath an enemy. And so this is speaking to this concept of the lesser hunger and you know what Kajangu would call the syndrome of foolishness is when you become a slave to your your carnal desires and things of that nature. And so when you're talking about the way of the warrior is the process in which a person has to satiate the lesser hunger, but is fighting against that access or that not access, but the excess in those particular desires. So having to hoard a lot of wealth, eating too much or whatever the vice may be, is overcoming that particular challenge. And so then you have what is called the way of the chief. And so the chief, when you think about it, so when you think about a warrior has to go and physically fight and do, whatever. It is more a carnal thing. But a chief is someone who sits and has to think and make decisions that affect an entire population. And so the way of the chief, even though in a lot of traditions, the chief, of course, is the military, head, just like here in the United States. But, so we say commander in chief. But for this, the satiation is about wisdom. And how wisdom allows you to think deeper and to get access to the deeper aspect of the deeper components of the universe. And so when you start asking questions like, who am I? Where did I come from? What is my purpose? And what must I do to fulfill that purpose? What is holding up the earth and the sun and the moon? What is the nature of light? When you start asking these deeper questions about reality, you have a different type of hunger that can only be satiated by wisdom. And so when a lot of these African epics, have to deal with the dual hungers and the nature of the open and closed senses and how the young person goes through these trials and tribulations to which are really initiations to where they're, you know, to use a cliche term, their third eye is open, and they're able to see, you know, reality in ways that they were not. And so one of the differences is that as far as like in the African tradition versus what I, you know, been able to read and witness amongst the Europeans, is that the way of the warrior in chief is a lived reality that's part of the culture, because everyone in a traditional society had to go through initiation. And so those trials and tribulations were the simulated trials and tribulations that you went through in initiation. And it's through your initiation that your closed senses, you know, were open or awakened in this life. And so they didn't have a third eye. You actually had four eyes. So these two eyes, and then two, you know, other eyes. And there was some allegedly sitting on top of the fontanelle, which is this top part, you know, of your skull or whatnot, in many parts of like Central and Southern Africa. And so, you know, it's a lived tradition. And so it's not something that you would, you know, hope and pray that someone, some divine demigod or whatnot, would come and be the savior. It's the way of the warrior is part of the general education system of the people itself. And so when any type of epic is literally talking about you, because it's just giving you some clues on how to survive your own initiation into manhood, into womanhood, into being able to take on the responsibility of maintaining and governing the community, village, or state. Because that's what it ultimately is. It's like, how do you run a state? You know, what is it? What kind of characteristics? So that's why, like, for example, in ancient Kemet, when you see certain depictions of Horus, you'll see on one side he has a head of Horus, but on the other side he has a head of Set. Because the ultimate issue that they're having here is two types of personalities that you're going to have in order to successfully run a state. It's just like when you see the emblems on the American insignia of the eagle holding the branch of peace on one foot or one leg or whatnot, but then it also has arrows in the other.
Right.
Because a king has to have a certain amount of not treacherousness, but warrior in them. Because if you were a person like Akhenaten, who's like, I can't kill a bee, you won't defend against, you know, any kind of threats or whatnot. And so you have to have that, you know, where you're generally peaceful, but when there's external or internal threats to the harmony of the society, then you have to put on a different face, and you have to be able to give that kill command. So it's about leadership. Like what does it take to be an effective leader in your household, in your community in general, and in terms of the state. So it wasn't these epics aren't just random stories because they're good to watch at the movies. It's like, no, you know, these are fundamental things. And I think that even in modern times that still is the case, even with you know, the movies and stuff that we see. You notice there's always in the movie this one character who is close to everybody, but who ends up being the traitor.
Right.
Why is that so ingrained in almost every single film, because they're teaching, they're communicating with their people that, you know, you got to look at everyone.
Right.
You really can't trust everyone 100%, because, you know, when you have a particular goal and mission, it's always at least this one person that knows you well and is intimate, knows you intimately, who may betray you and jeopardize the mission. So we have a new film out now, Judas, and what's the name of the film? Judas and
Black Messiah, isn't it?
in the something like that, dealing with the Black Panther Party.
Right.
And you know, the brother who sold out, you know, Fred Hampton for $300, you know, because he was in some other kind of trouble, you know, to the police. So they came in and murdered, you know, this young brother, and was shooting when his pregnant wife was in the room. They killed someone else, and you know, in the 70s, you know, in Chicago, and so, you know, you always have to be mindful of those different things. And so these types of ethics allow for these types of lessons to be learned, because those are some of those lesser hunger challenges that we have to deal with, not only your own, but others. You know, and so, you know, we look at Ptahhotep again, that last line, you know, I'm sorry, he that obeyeth his belly hath an enemy. You know, like if your focus, if you know, can't, like if you are a leader, for example, and of course you like beautiful and a male, you're a man and a leader, and of course you like beautiful women, but if you can't suppress that natural inclination to want to deal with a whole bunch of women, it will be you will become your own enemy. You know, and then of course you jeopardize the harmony and objectives, you know, of the community, state, or even organization, because you can't keep your thing in your pants, you know, or you're greedy. Greedy becomes, you know, your syndrome of foolishness, because, you know, you got to try to embezzle money. So now the whole organization and the community suffers, because you want to try to get some extra money on the side, you know, by illegal means. So you become your own enemy when you do not have a hold on your carnal desires. And these are the types of lessons that are being taught in these things. So when we're talking about a warrior, the hero, it is the one who has control over his emotions, who can fight off isfet. You know, there's a cognate for that term isfet in isiZulu language called isibute, which means the spirit of conflict. You know, and it's this spirit of conflict. If you don't get a control over that, you know, everyone suffers, because of course everybody's connected. So it's not just you, it's your family that suffers because of your actions. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to keep in mind when we have these discussions about, you know, African heroes. You know, our heroes are different. It's not just those who kill and slay the dragon. And then you know, they just live happily ever after. It's the journey, the hero's journey, the initiation process, the awakening of one's purpose, understanding why because in Africa, you know, we in general believe that, you know, the essence of who we are, our spirit, existed prior to us carnating here in human form. And so prior to us coming here, we got a set of papers and an objective to accomplish something once we arrive. And so, you know, part of your initiation and your personal hero's journey is remembering why you came here and what you came to do. And not only that, what gifts were given to you prior to your arrival here on Earth. And how are you supposed to use that in the betterment, in the strengthening of the community? And so all of those things in context is what's related in these particular types of concept of the warrior and hero. But it's all has to do with wisdom and being able to suppress one's carnal ways and discover oneself and one's purpose and one's gifts. And then, of course, the next stage, utilizing that to the benefit of the community.
You were talking about the concept of the chief as somebody who has his emotions under control, and somebody who can really, you know, think his way through things. This might actually be a question for LaMar. Do you think there's a reason that the Martian Manhunter has been played by a black man in every adaptation he's ever been in?
Yeah, I do.
Is he coded black?
I think so. And the reason why, you see his depictions, like what we were, you know how we've been making these references to people who in these books and stuff, like the stuff I was just reading from, they talk about how these people have these brows that come out. Like I have it, for example, like I have a brow that kind of comes out like that a little bit. But you know, that's one of his defining features as a character, you know, those things over his eyes and stuff. And then he's you know, he's what, I guess like maybe 7 feet tall, and he's bald headed and stuff like that. I mean, you know, if you put an afro on him, he could be Wilt Chamberlain or somebody, you know what I mean? As far as the way that he's portrayed, you know. So yeah, I've always thought that, you know, which is why it was crazy when they took him out of the Justice League and put Cyborg in. And I'm like, you know, you have the green guy who's basically a black guy, and you take him out and put a real black guy in. And it's like, that's not diversity, you know.
You're interchangeable. Diversity would be more replacing another one of those other white guys, though, right? Yeah. Specifically Hal Jordan. Anyway, let's move on to the next section.
Okay. I wanted to get into I go back to my sheet here. I wanted to get into like the comparison with a lot of like the Western folklore and even the folklore that we have as African people today in the diaspora. Like, for example, when you look at like the Brothers Grimm, for example, right? They're a case study in the importance of understanding folklore, because I don't think people realize that folklore is it's like a subgenre of anthropology now. So like you can actually go to school for it and stuff now. So when you get into like syncretism and all of that, that's an important aspect of folklore as well, because you know people move around constantly and they take their folklore with them, because their folklore is a representation of their culture and of their values, and it's like something you can, you know, metaphorically speaking, put in your pocket, right? So the Brothers Grimm, those stories that they wrote, and one of the brothers, he was a folklorist, right? So they were educated and stuff, and they combed through all of this like German folklore and things, and then they brought those stories out, and they basically were like cautionary tales for children. And there's some really like foul and grisly stuff in those stories if you actually read them in their important context. And of course, they actually influenced Adolf Hitler when he was putting his Third Reich together, because that was the way that they indoctrinated children. They would take like very example, and they would highlight like what they would call in beingness of the characters who ultimately end up like winning and stuff like that in the story, you know. So that German folklore shaped the way that these children were coming up, you know, because this is we tend to think about it as something like that whole thing. We think about it like it's just some grown folks going into meetings and eating sandwiches and like, yeah, hey, we hate all these non-white people. Let's go get them, right? But it wasn't. It was a process, just like anything else. So, folklore plays a big part in how people see themselves because their values are in their folklore. So, even when you come into America, for example, you know, you have your things like Paul Bunyan, Pecos Bill, and a lot of that stuff is based in like real people, like John Henry, for example, or you know, Buffalo Bill, you know, that stuff, and all of those things are based in people. And um, you know, so the values of those particular people are on display when you read those stories. And it's no different with us. Like, for example, you ever read a book called Wiley and the Hairy Man?
No.
Okay. Yeah, that book was you know, I'm in my early 40s. So
Okay.
I was a little boy growing up like in the early 80s and stuff. That was like one of the books that we had. But it's from the 70s, I think. But it basically involves this little boy named Wiley and his mother. They live out in the woods. And there's this character that they just call him the hairy man. He's like this short, you know, obviously hairy dude, and he's basically the trickster character, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he's yet another in the line of these West African trickster characters and things like that that you also see like in the Congo and places like that as well. Um, and they have to defeat him because they can't kill him. He's like a shapeshifter and you know and all of this other kind of stuff. He has all of these other powers that kind of imply that he can't be killed physically. You have to outsmart, make him go away. And his mother is like gauges in what we would call conjuring today, right? Or as we were saying,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Heka, right? So, um, you know, Wiley himself is intelligent, and his mother's obviously intelligent, so they work together. And you know, he's like, and the hairy man, like he eats children. That's basically what he does. So he like goes around eating people's children, and so they kind of like they have to like trick him 3 times, and after you trick him that third time, he doesn't come back again. So um just another like is you know when we talk about like folklore and stuff like that, like that's a it's a really good book. I strongly suggest anybody go buy it and check it out. Even as an adult, I love the book. um but there's a tendency like in African American folklore, for example, you know, we love hyperbole, right? So that's one of the storytelling agents that you see in folklore a lot. So with us, we all know somebody who you know that any story they tell, they exaggerate the story even if it's true, and then you could extract the parts that's true, but from the stuff, if you know them well enough, you know, we all know somebody like that, right? So and there's these little phrases that they'll say, like they'll be like, "I ain't lying," you know, and stuff like that, and it's like you you know what I mean? We all know people like that. So I wanted to talk about that particular aspect of like our own folklore, and it varies from region to region. You know, there's always these little stories, you know,
Yeah.
carry with us. You know, so I kind of want to talk about that some.
Um, what comes to mind, given what you just said, is Spike Lee
Mhm.
as a famous film director. And in undergrad, I took a course at the University of Houston on Spike Lee
Mhm.
as one of my African American Studies courses. And so one of the things that was pointed out in his in just storytelling in general is just what you said in terms of the extremes. Like you'll see, all these extremes, but it's necessary in order to have a clear, opposition of types, so to speak. And that's, I don't know if that's anything that's clearly necessarily African American. I think that is necessary so that you know that it is not necessarily supposed to be a true story. Like it's exaggerated so that you know that it's not to be taken literal, but at the same time, it's not that far fetched
Right.
that it is unbelievable, that it exists outside of reality, that, and so it's just there to be clear in the whole storytelling process in terms of those extremities. So like when you think of, for example, of Martin show, from the early 90s, Martin Lawrence, and you see these characters like Shanae and and Roscoe and any of the other characters in which he created. Like they're just, someone in your neighborhood, or at least I do, in the hoods that I grew up, of those types of individuals. Now it's exaggerated on the show, for funny's sake, but it's not that far off when it comes to, these types of personalities. And so you just want to have a clear personality. But in the end, as always, it's the purpose in part is so that you can see certain characteristics within yourself. You can see yourself reflected to some extent in these particular types of characters. And that's how at least in the African, saying tradition, and to an extent the African American tradition, it's always about you. You are the center of the story, and you are just expressed in all of these different characters in the narrative. So you should be able to identify with some aspect of each and one of these characters. And so the question is, how do you navigate, how do you negotiate the a harmonious existence with all of these personalities inside of you? So like, for example, when you go into Mali and you read the works of the late Amadou Hapatiba, who was a Fulani historian. You ever hear that proverb, when an elder dies, like it is though a library has burnt?
Yeah, burned to the ground. Yep.
Yeah, he's the one who uh, made known that phrase, and so everybody copies Amadou Hapatiba. And so, in one of his texts, is called it's originally written in French, but a lady translated it into English. It was available online about 10 years ago, but it's no longer available on the site because she was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was on the University of Pennsylvania site. And so luckily I copied it and downloaded it, and I made a PDF of it, and I uploaded it to my academia.edu site. So if any of y'all want to read this, what I'm about to say, you can go to, look up Asar Imhotep on academia.edu, and you'll see a document called Aspects of the Person by Amadou Hapatiba. And he talks about in this Malayan tradition that when you speak about a person, I can speak about LaMar as a person, as in the English, in the Western view, as a single entity. But that's not the case in Africa. In Africa, you have to speak of the people of the person, because there's multiple aspects of yourself. There's multiple beings that comprise you. You are really a composition of different entities. So it's just like something that you probably be more familiar with when you go into the ancient Egyptian literature. You know that the person consists of the Ba, the Khat, the Ren, their name, the Ib, their heart, mind, thinking ability. Like all of these are spirits, all of these are personalities that come together like Voltron and become the human person. And so for in the West African tradition, you know, the phrase would be the people of the person. And so it's, from an African standpoint, it is easier to see that this dynamic in the actual stories and myths and folklore that we see. Because, you know, even though you're looking at a screen with different actors, they're not different actors in reality, they're you. And these are your people of the person, you know, going through a conflict that you may be going through at some point in your life.
Right.
So again, how do you navigate those aspects of yourself that are in conflict and fighting for supremacy? You know, do you let your heart rule, or do you let your, you know, do you let the ib rule, or do you let you know, your mind, your thoughts, you know, or do you let your belly rule, your carnal desires, and something to, like, those extremes will be personified in any kind of folktale or whatnot in these particular types of stories. And so when, you know, from an African centered perspective, you have to look at our stories a little different instead of, you know, external articulations of reality. These are projections of the internal self and the people of the person or whatnot. And so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because you know that kind of perspective and worldview makes sense when you're talking about communal people. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so I wanted to point that out because, you know, especially when you were talking about the West African stuff. I you know, part of my mother's side, you know, we come from the Congo by way of West Africa, so people leave West Africa out of a lot of stuff, and you know, I'm not with, you know, so I'm glad you put it that way. I think, was there anything else I wanted to discuss? I don't think so.
I have a question.
Alrighty.
What would you say is you know, the fundamental similarities and differences between, you know, the typical Joseph Campbell hero's journey versus the African hero/warrior's journey?
I don't know if I remember enough of his articulation to make a distinction at this point. But is regarding the African, I would just reiterate what I stated earlier, that how should I say, and this would again be a major difference. It's just as what LaMar had just said. It's the communal aspect of the culture that everything should be understood within the context of community. So like in America, for example, like I'm an individual, but in Africa, I can't be an individual, you know, without saying it in this way, that I'm an individual in community. Which is why, for example, when you look at the ancient Egyptian literature, when somebody introduces themselves, they always say that I am so-and-so, son of so-and-so, and I come from this place, putting himself in the context of community, not just as an individual, like my name is Asar Imhotep. It's not I'm just Asar Imhotep, I'm Asar Imhotep, son of Harold Johnson Sr., son of, you know, Cynthia Johnson and Baptiste Foster and da from the village of the East Terrace on the east side of San Antonio and west side of Houston and all these different places. Like I would have to identify myself within the context of community. And that communal context shapes everything. So not only do you have a living community here on earth, you have another community on the other side, in the other realm. And so you were given instructions by elders in that community to come here to do something because the community, the living community, needs something. So, but the process of birth makes you forget that aspect of your history and reality. So the community has these periodic initiatory processes to help you awaken and remember why you came here. And so when we're talking about the hero's journey, the hero's journey in the African context is connected to the mission that you were given on the other side and the gifts that you were given to come here on earth and to help the community solve communal problems. So the hero's journey is you awakening into who you are and what your purpose is and what specific gifts that you came here with and what you're supposed to do with those gifts in the context of the strengthening and expansion of the community. And so it's always a communal context. It's not an individual, it's not simply an individual's journey, you know, because who's involved in your journey is the community. And so like in the African context, when you were born in indigenous societies, a divination is done to figure out who you are and why you came here. So when they do the divination and they talk to the spirits and the ancestors and they say, oh, this is, you know, Uncle so-and-so from so far back, and he's come back to do this, this, and this. They jot this down in whatever way that they jot it down, and they design a curriculum, an initiatory process to help you. Okay, so you have a similar thing. You have to go with these folks over here. You have to get initiated under these spirits and learn these things. Because it is this journey, it is these processes that is going to help awaken your gifts. And so the individual doesn't exist as an isolated thing. Your hero's journey includes the whole community, because they're the one who's putting you through the challenges for you to awaken yourself in a kind of a simulation type, just like in the X-Men, you know, simulation room. Like you create the simulation, you fight off and do all of this so you can develop yourself and get your skills. So when you come out in the real fight, you've already had some kind of experience, you know, fighting the sentinels and all of this other kind of stuff. And so it's the same way with these particular types of initiatory paths in these indigenous African wisdom traditions. And so I don't see that in Campbell's, you know, analysis in trying to be universal in understanding the hero's journey. As a matter of fact, there's a book that I recommend your viewers, if they are interested in learning more about this particular subject, and that is The Hero with an African Mask or an African Face.
LaMar's looking, he probably has it.
Yeah, I do have it. Yeah. I couldn't tell if I had it here at my office or whatever, but there's the book.
Yeah, The Hero with an African Face.
Yep.
You know, that's a good text that, you know, goes through different wisdom traditions in Africa to bring, you know, a deeper aspect of this very conversation. You know, from the Yoruba, Egyptian, you know, Akan traditions. He even deals with a few Native American, you know, concepts and things in that text.
Is that why the most, you know, obviously the most financially successful example of African heroic fiction is Black Panther is so incredibly rooted in his community?
Yeah, like you can tell it's just totally different than all of the other Marvel films and just comics, because they had to root it in the African cultures, and there's no way that you can do that without that aspect. So you notice that he just wasn't a ruler of the Wakanda by himself. When he came and sat on the throne, what was around him? A council of elders, because that's how indigenous African cultures do it. It is you can't just run off as a king by yourself and try to rule a country and you have just total authority over it. It's like, no, there's checks and balances there. And then you have to have a wise counsel around you, you know. And then the whole aspect, so it's just like Black Panther's a perfect example of this. So like when you see in the film when T'Challa's father died, and you see this community of other warriors and Black Panthers, you know, saying from times past when he goes into the spirit realm or whatnot to converse with his father. You know, it's everywhere you go. For us, you can't escape community. There's a village, like there's an ancestral village, there's a non-ancestral village and community, you know, just the eternal spirits that have been here or been there, as the term is in the con. And then you have your community, you know, in the living world. Like everything is communal based. And so there's a lot. Like Kugler had to do a lot of investigation. Like he just went to the continent, seeing like how things were done, and incorporated a lot of that into the film. And I know like a lot of stuff had to change because the original, you know, inclination of the Black Panther wasn't like what you see, you know, in the modern times, and especially with the I forgot what the brother's name is, the one who, the writer, the actual writer, because you know, of course, the original creators of Black Panther were white, and so you had some white thinking in how Black Panther moved and operated, and it was another brother who rewrote the story.
Oh, Reginald
and
Hudlin.
Yes,
Reggie Hudlin. Yeah.
And so, you know, some things had to happen, but like it's and into its incarnation now, like the whole fighting for, you know, who's going to be ruler, and you know, the importance of the Queen Mother, and all of that is important to the particular type of story. You know, the divinations, the calling on the ancestral spirits. You notice he called on Bas, and you know, which is an ancient Egyptian, you know, actually a lioness in ancient Kemet, but that Bas is found in Central Africa, in Central West Africa, in Cameroon, Nigeria. You know, and that's something that I deal with, you know, a lot in terms of those cultural connections, culture and linguistic connections between West Africa, West Central Africa, and Central Africa, and ancient Kemet. But yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah.
It is interesting because, like, I mean, LaMar, you know this, when John Henry Irons, the Man of Steel, he debuts, and then when he gets his own series, it's all about going back to his family and protecting his family. And
Yep. And you know, that's his thing as a hero. You know, he deals with a certain area, and the area he deals with is the neighborhood he lives in, and he's constantly interacting with like the children, and he's very involved in the community even when he's not wearing his costume. So, you know, that element of it too, you know.
I never intellectualized it as that until today. So I
it's
learned something today.
interesting. The what is that comedic's name? Yeah, that comedian's name. He did a skit. Dang, what is his name? He's on. You'll see him on Comedy Central, and even on. Like, I'm forgetting all kinds of names. He did a skit on the Avengers, but they were called something else, and he was talking about basically like when the person who was supposed to be like the spoof of Captain America, like how are y'all basically what were they the defenders, or I forgot what it was, but he's like, y'all have all these superpowers and y'all had this for this long and y'all never thought about trying to end racism and white supremacy. Like y'all go and try to fight the world. I mean, people from outer space and stuff to this nature, and try to save the world, but y'all don't want to deal with any of the domestic issues here. So you have Captain America with all those problems. He could have ended segregation and all of this other kind of stuff, but chooses not to, and so the same comedian was talking about how with the Black comics, you notice that they're always defending their neighborhood, like their block, because the issues are so bad there that they can't go and try to deal with other problems because they got to deal with the, saying the drugs and all this other kind of stuff in their particular community. But you never see like them trying to save the world or fight in the other galaxies and stuff like that. And I found that interesting, and just even how even in the comics it shows you the colonial mindset in terms of what they deem as problems.
Right.
And so you have all these super problems, certain stuff that they could deal with and say, but it's like, no, we won't deal with that. That's just normalized. So the racism, white supremacy, we'll just ignore that and let's fight off the quote unquote Nazis, but not our own Nazis in the United States dealing with Captain America, for example. So I find that interesting. That's something that needs to be looked at systematically. The colonial mindset, even within the comics itself, and how does that express itself in the narratives and the storyline, and who they choose to help, and what is considered a problem, amongst them, the amassing of resources. Like you have a floating city, but I'm pretty sure that there's still a whole bunch of homeless people in the Marvel universe, Skid Row, in LA. Like I don't know, maybe it's just not as exciting to end homelessness, with a superhero than it is, to fight Thanos.
Well, I think because with Marvel and DC, it's just that they have to, because they're going to continue theoretically forever. They want to be like, oh, we got to reflect the real world. We can't change it that much, which is why the comics that aren't about, that are more limited, like tend to do more of that stuff, I think. Yeah, but I don't know.
But yeah, like I can't recall if anyone, is there a comic where they took on the mafia or anything to that nature that you could recall?
I think the Punisher kills them, but
yeah.
He wiped them out. Yeah, but that's about it.
Also in Marvel, they're called the Magia.
Exactly.
I think to avoid any problems. Because comics back then were distributed by the mob or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's weird.
Brother Asar, a postulation that I had, like on the name of Narmer, even when you look at it on the Narmer palette, for example, it seems to me like uh, they say that it's a reference to the striking or the aggressiveness of the catfish, but I postulate that it's a reference to the catfish being bioelectric because that's how they hunt. And that catfish is the only place it's seen is up and down the Hopi, and in other places like in Southern Africa and stuff, you'll see it. That's the only place in the world that you see it. So the people there would have been familiar with it. And that's just my own postulation that it's a reference to the bioelectric nature of the catfish. You know, so I was curious about you know, in regards to that. When you look at the Narmer palette, it's like front and center. So I was curious about any postulation you might have on that.
Yeah, I had a similar hypothesis, you know, along those lines. It mainly initially or inspired by my linguistic study in trying to articulate the name Narmer, because it's not really Narmer, because when we transliterate the name, for those who understand how we transliterate hieroglyphs, you write it lowercase n, lowercase a, and r. And that lowercase a sound is not a real a as in English, or an ah as in English. It is well, some linguists will say it's a D sound. And so it'd have been nadir or something along those lines, you know, mar or mer. I argue that it was a velar type sound, like either a velar or like a guttural type, plosive type sound, like a k or a k, you know, or something to that nature. And, you know, Mboli argues it was like an H sound, and in some instances a glottal stop. So it's some debate going on in terms of the actual, but we know that it's a consonant. And so it's from my initial language comparisons that when I looked into the Chiluba language and found a cognate for it, and it was electric catfish. And I wondered, you know, is the electric component, you know, associated with or a reason for its association with that particular ruler that we call Narmer. And you know, but there's a knowing Africans, there's a many possibilities, and you know, it could be a clan totem, you know, or for example, you know, how hard is it to catch a catfish of size? You know, so like that, its evasive nature could be a reason why it is associated. And I don't think we'll ever know unless we, you know, come across some Nilotic speaking people who still use it either as a totem or as part of a name. And then we can get some kind of semblance. But yeah, I thought about that and wondered, you know, is it because, you know, he's, you know, in military terms, you know, like shock and awe. Is that like, was that a natural equivalent of shock and awe that this person was trying to emulate? Because remember that in ancient Kemet and many other societies, especially that emerged from a pastoralist group, the king is a warrior leader, which is why on the Narmer palette you see him fighting. You know, I think a group of quote unquote Asiatics, as the literature would say, on the palette. And so what they have to convince the people is that this is why you always see them young in the depictions. So all of the kings, and no matter how old they are, like Ramesses ruled for like 60 years, 60, 63 years. But all of his depictions of him in his young 20s, you know, strapping and strong, because you are to present to the public this show of strength. And so, you know, a lot of if it's not an electric catfish, a lot of them were associated with a bull. And so it's the same thing. It's a strong bull ready to attack, you know, and to protect and defend the nation. And so it's with that possibility that I'm thinking that the electric component of the catfish may have something to do with why that is attached to his name. And so the question then would be, is this a birth name, or was this an initiatory name, or was this name given to him, or did he just name himself that name? And so it'll be that'll be some interesting research for some young budding researcher out there in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it correlates, that particular concept. It correlates with the whole code name thing, and then like the civilian name that nobody knows, because there's all sorts of reasons why. Of course, if you're this figure that was possibly chosen by people to do something, which in some of the literature about Narmer, it kind of suggests that he was chosen to do what he did by the people. But you wouldn't want anybody knowing your real name,
Yeah.
So, when you go forth, you don't want anybody knowing your intricate details like that, so they can't come at you on a side tip and do some other stuff,
Exactly. Like I'm opening up Illusion Volume 2, and I want to say that I have something in here. I have a debate on the etymology of the word Allah. And there's a chapter in here and I type Ela, time, and the Into concept of God, spirit. But I go into that notion of, hopefully I can find it real quick if it's in this text. Yeah, so there's a text where, the god Ra is bitten by a snake and is poisoned, and he's trying to call out the name of the poisons and the snakes, but he can't do it because his it's a part of himself, and he calls on his daughter Isis to try to, because she's a master at spells and things of this nature to get rid of the poison. Well, that's one story, and then another story is where Heru is bitten by a snake and is poisoned, and so kind of a similar thing. But on this one, it's Ra, and she's trying to get Ra's real name. So Ra is not his real name, and so in the text, it is, and I provide the transliteration and the translation for those who are interested. Ra says, "I am the eldest son of the eldest, divine seed who came into being out of a god. I am the great one, son of the great one. The Father devised the name. I have many names, many forms. He whose form is every god." So every god is Ra, technically, who is called Atum Horus Hekanu. My father and my mother told me my name. So Ra has a mother and father in this text, and hid it from my children in my body to prevent it happening that a male or a female magician strike against me. And it goes on to say some other stuff. But it goes to show that this notion that if somebody knows your real name, any kind of magician, people who knows how to do and conjure up spells, can access the inner aspect of you. And matter of fact, in the one of the books you held up, the Where is the Love, and I re-emphasize it in Illusion Volume 2, I talk about how the Ren, your name, is your actual soul in African tradition. So when people talk about the soul in Africa, they're talking about your name, because again, your name encompasses your purpose, and it is a unique identifier to you. So if somebody can call your name, they can awake you, so you respond to it. So, you know, somebody you heard LaMar down the street, you would automatically turn your head trying to figure out who's calling you, because it identifies with you, it resonates with you. So in the magical world of the Africans, and even for the physicians, because that's how they deal with medicine. So you can't just you just can't put together and grind up some ingredients and then give it to the person and hope the medicine works. It has to be followed with chance, because you have to direct the medicine and tell it what to do in the body according to, you know, indigenous medical practices. And so so it's that same logic when it comes to this particular story, that, you know, my parents hid my name in my body so that nobody can access it. So no male or female magician, you know, will strike against me because they know my name. And so what happens usually is that the king, the name that you know a king in history, may not be their real name.
Right.
It is usually an initiatory name or some kind of, you know, nickname or something, but their name you won't know.
Yeah.
You know.
And we see that today in our culture, because, you know, we know that in the suit, you know, they had a name that probably nobody knew but them and their mother, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And we have names that our mothers call us. And like my mom, peace be upon her, there was a name she called me, and she never called me that name unless we were alone. So like my grandma, peace be upon her, who raised me and stuff, she didn't know that name, you know?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Matter of fact, to a lesser extent, we still do it in hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't come out with your birth name unless you're Will Smith, you know. Now it's you have a name that you create. Is your real name, you know, is for you and the homies and your family. But, you know, the public is Method Man, Old Dirty Bastard, you know, Raekwon the Chef, you know, like they don't get the real names. And so, but yeah.
So thank you for gracing our channel with your presence. Hopefully some folks out here learn something. Because if you didn't learn something from this show, you just won't try to learn nothing.
You guys just gave up.
Yeah. You know. So I guess yeah, we're gonna give you the parting words, and then you can let everybody know where they can reach you, and then we'll put your tags and stuff in.
I appreciate it. Well, first and foremost, again, thank you for having me on your platform, and for the questions and the topic. You know, a very important topic, and I appreciate all that you are doing and all that you do on this particular show and platform. And so I'm fairly new to it, and so I'm still catching some episodes, and I like what you guys are doing. And in regards to my contact information, I'm pretty much on all the major social media platforms: Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I'm not on TikTok. And anything else, that's my social media limit. But you can contact me directly from my website, and that is asarimhotep.com. So you can find out more about me, and or you can. Well, I'll be launching this website soon, but it's going to be chinaintofilms.com. And so I'm still working on the site, but it's going to be the hub and location for a documentary film that I'm starting the fundraising process for. And this is going to be dealing with the relationship between the Bantu speaking cultures and languages in relationship to ancient Egypt and Kemet. And so I want to visualize a lot of what I've talked about in this text and some other research in other texts by other scholars, showing that relationship and how you can understand. Actually, you can understand each other by referencing and studying these two different groups, the ancient Egyptians and the modern Bantu speakers. And, they kind of reinforce. And so some things that isn't necessarily answered in ancient Kemet, you can find an answer amongst the Bantu speaking people. And then, you get some clarity on certain things if you understand amongst the Bantu speaking people with that which you find in ancient Kemet. And so this may be probably a 2 or 3 series documentary if all goes well, but that'll be another area. So you'll be able to find out in what ways you can, help and contribute. And, and we can talk about, for example, like, I'm surprised we didn't, like how ancient Egypt in many respects is the origin of the whole comic idea. And so we say comic books, but they had comic monuments.
Yeah, the sequential art and stuff. Yeah,
exactly. So they told a storyline in fragments, and you had the meta-netra text, on the side, giving you the blow by blow, the dialogue between the characters in on the papyri and on the buildings. Mm-hmm. And so, the only thing that they were missing in the fight scenes was the old Batman pow, bang, stuff that you would see in the old school comic books. But even the whole concept of a comic is born out of ancient Egypt. And so that's the first place that you really see like these dialogues in what we would consider comic book fashion. And so it just shows that the intrigue with comic books and then of course their transition to film is an ancient, primal, if you want to say, interest and culture fact, of Homo sapiens, and is still living in the modern time in the comic book context. And so, we'll probably get into a little bit of that in the film as well. And
awesome.
But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Okay. And put your Cash App information up there too for the people that want to donate to your research, because all these books I got over here, I pay for all of mine because I don't have that.
Yeah, I understand. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Cash App is just $Asar Imhotep, ASARIMHOTEP. And yeah, and so AsarImhotep.com is the website, and Asar Imhotep on all the other Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, our brother got all kind of books here. We got the Suit Bitty. We have the Aluja Volume 1. Y'all can get that. And Where's the Love? This is one you definitely need to pick up. Get all the books tattooed on you the weekend after you get
it. But wear a mask when you do.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you, Asar.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Everybody, Asar's links are down below. Let us know what you think in the comments, and feel free to hit him up.